The growl came first. Low, continuous. The kind of sound that didn't rise or fall but simply existed, like the hum of a power line, constant, controlled, and carrying within it the unmistakable promise of consequence. It was the first thing anyone heard when they walked through the double-glass doors of American Legion Post 117 on that Thursday afternoon. Not the soft organ music piped through aging speakers in the corner. Not the muffled conversations of 43 people who had come to honor a fallen man. Not the quiet weeping of a 7-year-old girl in a black dress who didn't fully understand why her father wasn't coming home, but understood, in the way children always do, that the silence where his voice should have been was now permanent. No, the first thing was the growl. Dagger sat in front of the crate like something carved from obsidian. A Belgian Malinois, 72 pounds of muscle and absolute conviction, his amber eyes moving across the room in slow, methodical sweeps. The crate behind him was military-grade transportation black, sealed, bearing the official markings of Naval Special Warfare Command. Inside it, or so everyone had been told, rested what remained of Petty Officer First Class Owen Harker, SEAL, husband, father. And the reason every uniformed person in that room was standing a careful 5 feet away from a dog that had not moved in 3 hours. 3 hours. That was how long Dagger had been sitting there. 3 hours without water. 3 hours without command. 3 hours of that unwavering mechanical growl that seemed to say, I know something you don't, and you will not pass. Staff Sergeant Garrett Polk had tried 3 times. The first time, he approached with his hands open and low, the universal K9 approach signal, textbook procedure. Dagger's head swiveled toward him, and the amber eyes locked on with a precision that had nothing casual about it. Polk stopped at 4 feet, reconsidered, retreated. The second time, Polk brought a tactical leash, the heavy-duty kind used for operational dogs in the field. He made it 9 feet before Dagger stood, not lunged, not barked. Simply stood, shifted his weight forward onto his front paws, and dropped his head below the line of his shoulders. The posture of a dog that has calculated the distance and found it acceptable. Polk stopped. The leash stayed in his hand, unused. The third time, Polk brought 2 security personnel from the base detail. The 3 of them formed a loose triangle and moved forward together. Dagger's growl shifted pitch, a single, barely perceptible drop in frequency that somehow communicated an entirely different category of intent. A ceramic water glass on the refreshment table vibrated against its saucer and toppled sideways, rolling off the edge and shattering on the tile floor. The 3 men stopped. One of the security personnel took a step back before Polk gave him a sharp look. Mad dog, said a voice from the front row. Brett Larson, broad-shouldered and 6'2", sat with his arms crossed over his dress blues, his jaw set at the angle of a man who had decided the room owed him deference. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't try. Same as its handler. The room didn't push back. 43 people, and not one of them said a word. In the last row of folding chairs, pressed against the far wall, as though she had calculated the greatest possible distance between herself and the center of the room, Nora Ashford sat with her hands placed flat on her thighs. She was 34 years old, slight, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke not of recent grief, but of the accumulated weight of something much older. She wore a plain black dress with long sleeves despite the warmth of the hall. Her hair was pulled back with a precision that struck no one as anything other than the tidiness of a woman trying to hold herself together. No one sat beside her. Her back was straight. Not the rigidity of a person trying not to cry. Something different. Something that belonged to a person who had long ago ceased to be aware of how their spine held itself, because certain things had been practiced until they became indistinguishable from instinct. In a room where most people were hunched slightly forward with the weight of the occasion, Nora Ashford's posture was the single architectural anomaly. Her shoulders were squared at exactly the angle that maximized peripheral vision. Her hands were settled, not gripping. And though her eyes were directed toward the floor, they moved, just slightly, each time a door opened or a person shifted position near the exits. Nobody noticed. They weren't looking at Nora. They were looking at the dog. If you've ever felt like an outsider in the place where you most deserve to belong, this story is for you. Before we go any further, Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below. Have you ever watched someone get judged before anyone bothered to find out who they really were? We read every single one. Now let's get back to Nora, because this room is about to find out exactly how wrong it's been. Major Wade Brannock, the officer tasked with coordinating the memorial service, moved through the rows with the controlled efficiency of a man accustomed to managing logistics that refused to cooperate. He was 51, silver at the temples, with the kind of face that had learned to express authority without expending energy on anything as inefficient as emotion. He stopped at the end of the last row and looked down at Nora. Mrs. Ashford. He kept his voice professional, which in context meant stripped of warmth. There's a waiting area outside the main hall. You might be more comfortable. I'm fine here. Her voice was quiet, not weak. There was a distinction. Brannock held the pause for 2 seconds, which was how long it took him to decide she wasn't going to expand on that. The K-9 situation is being handled. This area is technically classified as a military asset staging area, and you said that when you met me at the door, Nora said, still quiet, still directed at the floor. I heard you the first time. Brannock's jaw tightened by a fraction. He moved away. Across the room, Sandra Hayfield stood near the floral arrangements with the composed posture of a woman who had decided what this day would look like and intended to enforce it. She was 61, dressed in a black suit that had clearly been pressed that morning, and she wore her grief like a distinction, visibly, publicly, in a way that communicated her ownership of it. She was Owen Harker's mother. She had driven 18 hours from Virginia, and she had, upon entering the hall and identifying Nora, walked deliberately to the refreshment table and selected a position that required her to pass within 3 feet of her daughter-in-law without acknowledging her presence. That had been 4 hours ago. Now she moved toward Nora with the purposeful stride of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say. She stopped in front of her and said it. My son deserved better. The words were delivered without elevation. Flat. More damaging for it. He deserved a wife who understood what service meant, what sacrifice meant. Instead, he spent his last years worrying about a woman who... Mrs. Hayfield. Chaplain Marcus Webb materialized at Sandra's elbow with the gentle persistence of a man who had spent 23 years defusing rooms that were about to become something more difficult. Perhaps this isn't the moment. Sandra looked at him, then at Nora, then back at him. She extended her right hand. Nora did not take it. Not because she was being difficult. She hadn't moved her eyes. Her hands remained flat on her thighs. Sandra withdrew her hand and walked back to the floral arrangements. Webb crouched slightly to Nora's eye level, which required some effort given his height. Mrs. Ashford, I know this is incredibly hard. If it would help to speak privately, I have... Thank you, Chaplain. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry. That seemed to unsettle him more than tears would have. I'm fine where I am. He straightened, patted the air in a gesture that meant something in its intention and nothing in its execution, and moved away. Lily came from the far corner of the room, where her Aunt Rosa Ashford had been sitting with her for the past hour. She was 7 years old and wearing a dress that was slightly too large because it had been bought for a cousin's recital 6 months ago, and no one had thought ahead to buy another one. Around her neck, on a chain that was too long for her and had to be looped twice, hung a set of military dog tags. Owen Harker's name, Owen Harker's blood type, Owen Harker's identification number, pressed into metal that was now warm from being held against a child's chest for most of the day. She moved through the room in the way that children move, without strategy, without pretense, following some interior compass that adults have long since learned to override. She passed Brett Larson, who watched her with the expression of someone who had decided that sympathy was permissible only within limits he had privately defined. She passed Brannock, who clocked her passage with the practiced eye of a man cataloging movement in a room. She passed the row where Tommy Riggs sat, a SEAL, one of Owen's, lean and quiet in a way that was different from the stillness of the other operators in the room. And Tommy watched her with something in his face that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it. She walked to the crate. The room understood before anything happened. The conversations nearest the crate stopped. Heads turned. Brannock took a step forward. Polk, who had been conferring with the 2 security personnel about his next approach strategy, looked up. Lily stopped 3 feet from the crate. The dog tags caught the overhead light. Dagger's growl went silent. 43 people held their breath. The Belgian Malinois rose from his position, slow, deliberate, hindquarters lifting first, and his amber eyes moved from the room to the child in front of him. His tail, which had been motionless for 3 hours, began to move. One slow sweep to the right, one sweep back. He took a single step forward, and then he lowered his broad, scarred head and pressed his muzzle gently against Lily's chest, directly over the dog tags hanging there. A sound moved through the room. Not a gasp. Something softer than that and more unnerved. Lily lifted her small hand and placed it on top of Dagger's head. Nobody moved. Nobody moved for almost 30 seconds. And those 30 seconds had a quality that most people in that room would remember without being able to fully articulate why. The sensation of witnessing something that operated according to logic they didn't have access to. It was Polk who broke it. He crossed the room with the decisive movement of a man reclaiming an operational situation that had deviated from its intended parameters. He unclipped the tactical leash from his belt as he walked, the metallic sound carrying in the now silent hall. "All right," he said, his voice carrying the manufactured calm of authority that has made up its mind. "That's enough. The dog needs to come with me." He reached Lily, stepped around her, and moved his hand toward Dagger's collar. Nora Ashford stood up. It wasn't dramatic. She simply rose from the chair and crossed the 12 feet between her row and the crate with the efficiency of someone who had already calculated the number of steps before she began moving. She reached Polk's extended arm before his fingers closed on the collar and placed her hand on his forearm. Not a grab, not an aggression. A stop. "Not like that," she said. Polk looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. "Mrs. Ashford, I'm the certified K9 handler for this unit, and I need you to—" "You're approaching from his guard angle," she said, not loud, not urgent, the way a person states a measurement. "If you clip the leash from that side when he's in protection posture, you'll create a conflict response. Come around to his left. Lower. Let him turn to you first." Polk stared at her. The room stared at her. She was not looking at Polk. She was watching Dagger with a focused peripheral attention of someone accustomed to reading small signals from large animals in conditions that did not offer the luxury of being wrong. "I appreciate the concern," Polk said, with the particular pronunciation men use when they mean the opposite. "But I have 17 years of K9 experience, and I don't need—" "He's favoring his left hind leg," Nora said. "Watch when he shifts his weight. He corrects early, before it becomes visible. That started in August, after the Kandahar jump. It's a hip joint issue. It hasn't been logged in his medical record, which means it hasn't been treated, which means he's been working in pain for 4 months, and anyone who approaches him without accounting for that is increasing his stress load." Complete silence. Dr. Paula Streck, the unit's K9 veterinarian, had been standing near the wall for the past 20 minutes with the quiet watchfulness of a woman who preferred observation to conversation. At Nora's words, she moved. Not quickly, but she moved. She crouched beside Dagger, who tolerated her presence with the resigned patience of an animal that knew the difference between a threat and a nuisance. Her hands moved along his flank, then down toward the hip joint. She pressed. Dagger's ear twitched. He did not vocalize, but the micro-shift in his weight distribution was immediate and unmistakable. Streck looked up at Polk, then at Nora. "She's right. There's sensitivity here that shouldn't be present." Her voice was careful. "How did you know about the August jump?" Nora said nothing. Polk's face had taken on the reddish quality of a man who has been corrected in front of an audience and has not yet decided what to do with that information. "I don't know what Owen told you about his operational schedule," he said, "but what you're describing is internal unit information that isn't—" "Sergeant Polk." The voice came from the far side of the room, and it had a weight to it that rearranged the acoustics without effort. Craig Donovan was not in uniform. He was a broad man in his mid-50s with the compact musculature of someone who had stayed operational longer than most, and showed it in the way he held himself, rather than in any identifying marker. He had been standing near the windows for the past hour with the stillness of a man who was not actually at rest. He looked at Polk. "Let it go." Polk looked at Donovan. Something passed between them. The kind of communication that required no words because it had been practiced across enough operational environments that both men knew exactly what it meant. Polk stepped back from the crate. Donovan looked at Nora. His eyes were flat and specific. "A word," he said. not a question. He crossed toward her and positioned himself between her and the nearest cluster of people with the unconscious geometry of a man accustomed to creating privacy in public spaces. When he spoke, his voice was below the ambient noise of the room, designed to carry to her and no further. "Don't complicate today," he said. "Whatever you think you know, keep it to yourself. For Lily." Nora looked at him. Her face did not change. "Sector 7, she said. Her voice was quieter than his. 3rd of November, 2 years ago, 30 seconds before Owen's last radio transmission." She paused. "You were the ranking officer on that channel." Donovan's face did not move, but something behind his eyes did, a rapid, involuntary recalibration that a person would only recognize if they had been trained to look for it. He straightened, walked back to the windows without another word. Tommy Riggs, from his seat 3 rows back, watched Donovan walk away. Then he looked at Nora with an expression that had nothing of the room's dismissal in it. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds before looking down at his hands. The look had contained something specific, not recognition exactly, something closer to the adjustment a person makes when they have been operating on an assumption that has just become insufficient. From the administrative desk at the back of the hall, Diane Foswell's laptop produced a soft chime. She glanced at the screen with the automatic attention of a coordinator, expecting a catering confirmation or a schedule update. The chime had announced neither. The screen read, "Access restricted. Clearance level Delta required." Below it, in smaller text, the name she had queried, Ashford Nora Marie. Diane looked at the screen. She looked at Nora. She looked back at the screen. She did not call anyone over. She minimized the window and sat very still for a moment. Then she straightened her notepad and said nothing to anyone. We're right at the moment where the room is starting to ask the questions it should have asked from the beginning. If this story is pulling at something in your chest, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell us in the comments, what do you think Nora's real background is? We'll be right back in just a moment, because the next 60 seconds are going to flip everything you think you know about this room. Brannick had spent the past 10 minutes on his phone, speaking in the clipped half-sentences of a man who wanted answers and wasn't getting comfortable ones. He crossed back to Diane's desk, looked at her screen. She had minimized the restricted access window, but not closed it, and the corner of it was visible in the taskbar. His eyes dropped to it. He looked at Diane. "Pull it up again," he said. She did. He read it twice. "Get me the actual file," he said. "Sir, it's restricted at Delta level. I don't have authorization to—" "I know what it means." He handed the laptop back to her. "Find someone who does." His voice had acquired a quality it hadn't carried before, not urgency exactly, but the particular focus of a man who has discovered that the floor of a room he thought he understood is not where he believed it to be. Meanwhile, at the far end of the hall, near the windows that let in the thin November light, Earl Hutchins was doing what Earl Hutchins had done for the past 2 hours, sitting very still and watching very carefully. He was 78 years old, a Vietnam veteran who had been coming to American Legion post 117 for 31 years. He had a face like weathered timber, a hearing aid in his right ear that he adjusted periodically, and the capacity for sustained, patient attention that certain people develop and never lose. He had been watching Nora since she walked in, not with the hostility of Larson or the bureaucratic assessment of Brannick, not with Sandra Hayfield's particular brand of grief as accusation. He watched with the focused neutrality of a man who had learned over a very long time that the most important information in any room is usually to be found by watching the person everyone else has decided to ignore. He rose from his chair with the deliberate care of a man who had had both knees replaced and remained proud enough not to let it show more than necessary. He crossed the room and sat down in the empty chair 2 seats from Nora. She didn't look at him. Neither of them spoke for almost a minute. He looked down at her hands. They were resting flat on her thighs, the same position they had been in for hours, relaxed in the way that trained hands rest, not slack, but settled. He looked at the exposed inch of her left wrist below the sleeve cuff, a lateral scar, thin and old, running parallel to the tendons, the kind of mark that came from rope under tension or a restraint. He had seen that kind before, on people who had come back from specific kinds of places and specific kinds of situations. His eyes moved to her right hand. The knuckles were calloused in a pattern he recognized, not from fighting, from equipment. Rope, harness, weapon grips used consistently over years. The calluses on her index and middle finger were placed in a way that suggested the habitual operation of a trigger mechanism, not a target shooter's calluses, an operator's. "You're not a civilian," he said. His voice was low and conversational, aimed at the middle distance between them. She turned her head and looked at him. For the first time since she'd entered the room, she looked at someone with something other than careful blankness. There was an assessment in her gaze that was brief and precise, and arrived at a conclusion within 2 seconds. "I'm Lily's mother," she said. Earl absorbed this. "That's true," he said. He nodded slowly, in the way of a man who knows the difference between an evasion and a lie, and is choosing to respect both. "That's the truest thing you could have said." He reached into the pocket of his old herringbone vest, and his fingers closed around something small and heavy. He didn't take it out. Not yet. He looked back at the crate, at Dagger, who was still sitting beside Lily, with the attentiveness of an animal performing a specific and deliberate function. "That dog hasn't moved from that crate in 3 hours, Earl said. But the second that child got close, the animal stood down. Now, I've been around working dogs all my life. I know what a dog does when it meets someone its handler loved, and I know what a dog does when it meets someone it was trained by." He paused. "Those are 2 different responses." Nora said nothing. "The dog recognized something," Earl said. "I'm just trying to figure out if it was her or what she's wearing." The dog tags, Owen's dog tags, hanging against Lily's chest. Nora's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way a still surface shifts when something moves beneath it. "He recognized both," she said, and then she said nothing more, and Earl, who had lived long enough to know when a conversation had given him everything it was going to, sat back in his chair and let the silence be what it was. Across the room, the dynamic was rebuilding its momentum in the way that rooms full of aggrieved people tend to do, through accumulation rather than confrontation. Polk was speaking in low tones to the 2 security personnel again, demonstrating with his hands a revised approach strategy. Brannick was still waiting on the database clearance. Sandra Hayfield had moved to a position nearer to the crate, which meant nearer to Lily, which was either grief or the assertion of a territorial claim that had no language for itself other than proximity. Brett Larson was on his feet now, his arms uncrossed, his weight shifted forward in the subtle stance of a man who had decided that something needed to happen and was preparing to be the one to make it happen. In the corner near the administrative desk, the conversation between Donovan and Tommy Riggs had taken a turn that was not visible to anyone watching, but was entirely legible to anyone who knew how to read 2 men standing 2 feet apart with their backs to the room. "She knows about the channel," Donovan said, not a whisper. "Controlled projection, the kind that carried no further than intended." Tommy didn't look at him. "How much?" "Enough." Tommy's jaw worked. "She knows because Owen told her." "Owen didn't know the full picture." "Then how does she—" Tommy stopped. He looked at the side of Donovan's face. Something shifted in his expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite the absence of it. "What did Owen not know?" Donovan said nothing. Tommy turned and looked at Nora across the room. The look lasted 3 seconds and arrived at a decision. He moved away from Donovan without another word. It was Brannick who escalated it. He crossed to the center of the room, positioned himself where he could be seen by everyone, and spoke at a volume that made his intentions clear. "I need everyone's attention for a moment." The room quieted, the particular quiet of people who have been waiting for someone to take control of a situation that had been uncomfortable for too long. "I've reviewed the status of the K-9 asset assigned to Petty Officer Harker, and I want to confirm that procedures for reassignment will be initiated following the conclusion of this service. Staff Sergeant Polk will coordinate the transfer." It was not directed at anyone specific. It didn't need to be. Sandra Hayfield's shoulders relaxed by a fraction of an inch. Nora looked at the crate. She looked at Lily, who had both hands in Dagger's fur now, her face pressed against the top of his head in the way of a child who has found the one thing in the room that is warm and uncomplicated. Nora looked at Dagger, who was looking back at her with the amber-eyed patience of an animal waiting for a signal. She said nothing. Larson stood, rolled his neck, and moved into the space between Nora and the crate, with the casual deliberateness of a man who has decided that the most useful thing he can do is exist in a specific location. He was a large man, and he used that largeness the way some people use volume, as a statement that requires no articulation. Owen deserved a memorial, not a situation, he said. He was looking at Nora. You've been creating situations since you walked in the door. Brett. Tommy Riggs's voice came from his left. He had crossed the room without anyone noticing, which was a skill set entirely distinct from ordinary movement. That's enough. Larson turned. Stay out of it, Riggs. I'm already in it, Tommy said. The two men looked at each other with the particular tension of people who have operated together in life and death conditions, and therefore know exactly what the other one is capable of. Step back. From behind Larson, the sound that broke the standoff was not a human sound. It was the soft, high-frequency whimper of a 7-year-old girl who had registered the escalating tension in the room through whatever frequency children receive such signals and had moved, arms out, face crumpled, toward the one thing in the room that was making sense to her. Lily pressed herself against Nora's side. Nora's arm came around her daughter's shoulders in the automatic geometry of a person who has performed this specific motion 10,000 times. With her other hand, without looking at it, without apparent thought, she adjusted the chain of the dog tags around Lily's neck so that the tags themselves rested flat against the child's sternum rather than twisted to the side. It was such a small gesture, the kind of thing parents do with the absent fluency of repetition. Dagger made a sound, not a growl, something lower and more purposeful. He rose from his seated position and moved to Lily's side, pressing the length of his body against the child's left flank, a wall of animal warmth that had nothing uncertain about it. Polk moved. 2 security personnel moved with him. Brannick was already raising his hand to signal them forward. The triangle of approach that had failed 3 times was reassembling with a 4th attempt, clearly intended to succeed through force of organizational authority rather than any revised understanding of the animal it was directed at. Dagger needs to be secured, Polk announced. This is a controlled procedure. Everyone please, don't. Nora said it without moving. The word was quiet and total, the way a door closing is quiet and total. No one listened. The 3 men closed the distance to 8 feet, 6 feet. Dagger's body shifted against Lily, his weight settling lower, hindquarters gathering. The growl returned, not the earlier continuous sound, but something new, something that had architecture and intention. Donovan moved from across the room, not toward the crate, toward Nora. He came around behind her and to her left, and when his hand closed on her arm, above the elbow, the grip of a man who is accustomed to physically redirecting people, he leaned close and said, "Don't do this." It was a mistake, not because of Nora, because of the physics of what happened next. She turned into the grip rather than away from it. The instinctive counter-move of someone whose first training had included escape from exactly this contact, and the rotation of her body against the direction of his force put her left forearm across the top of his grip and broke his hold cleanly, without visible effort, without any particular drama. The sleeve of her dress, which had snagged under his thumb in the moment of contact, tore. A clean horizontal rip, 3 inches, from the outer seam toward the inner forearm. The fabric pulled back. The room went still. Not because of the tear itself, because of what the tear exposed. On the inner forearm of Nora Ashford's left arm, where the sleeve had covered it since she walked through the door 3 hours ago, was a tattoo. The image was precise and fine-lined, rendered with the kind of detail that spoke of someone who had not made this decision lightly. A Belgian Malinois in perfect seated posture, head level, eyes forward, composed with the bone-deep patience of an animal that knows exactly what it is for. Below the image, in a clean military typeface, Ghost K9, JSOC. And below that, smaller, Unit 7. No one spoke. Not Donovan, not Polk, not Brannick, who had stopped mid-gesture with his hand still raised. Not Brett Larson, who had turned at the sound of fabric tearing and was now standing with his weight distributed between both feet and an expression on his face that he would later have difficulty describing accurately to anyone who asked. 3 seconds of absolute silence. The kind that doesn't occur naturally in a room of 43 people. It has to be created by something that has entered the room and temporarily overridden every other operating frequency. Earl Hutchins rose from his chair. He did it without reaching for the armrests. straight up, both knees, without the careful leverage of a man who needs assistance. He stood at his full height in the back of the room and looked at the woman in the front of it, and his right hand rose to his temple in a salute that had the muscle memory of 50 years behind it. Not ceremonial, not performative. The salute of a soldier, recognizing a soldier. Nora looked at him. For the first time all afternoon, something changed in her face that had nothing strategic about it. She looked at her arm, at the exposed tattoo, at Donovan, who had taken 3 steps back and whose complexion had shifted to the particular grayish quality of a man running rapid internal calculations, none of which were arriving at reassuring conclusions. Dagger made the sound again, not the growl, not the whimper. Something between them, directed not at the crate and not at the room, but at Nora, direct, personal. The sound a dog makes when it has been waiting for something, and has finally, after a very long time, identified it. She looked at him. He looked back. The amber eyes held. She said 2 words. Dutch, precise, low, dagger, zit. The Belgian Malinois sat, perfectly, instantly, with the absolute compliance of an animal responding not to a stranger's command, not to a handler's familiar voice, but to something that lived below the level of familiarity, in the architecture of the commands themselves, in the specific pitch and spacing that had been drilled into his responses over hundreds of hours by a single pair of hands, the hands standing in front of him now. Polk's tactical leash hung unused at his side. No one in the room moved for a long moment. The organ music, which had been playing softly through the corner speakers all afternoon, reached the end of its programmed loop and stopped. In the silence that followed, the only sounds were the ventilation system above the ceiling tiles and the quiet, steady breathing of a 72-pound dog that had finally received the signal it had been waiting 3 hours for. Tommy Riggs, from his position 6 feet to Nora's left, closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, his expression had the quality of a man releasing something he had been holding for a long time. Not grief, not relief. Something more complex than either. The expression of a person who has been carrying a piece of information that belonged to someone else and has finally been permitted to set it down. And then the double glass doors at the far end of the hall opened and Rear Admiral Raymond Whitfield walked in. He was not on the schedule. He was not on any list that Brannick had prepared or that Diane Foswell had organized. He was 63 years old, in full dress uniform, with the particular stillness of a man who has stopped needing to announce himself because the weight of his presence does the announcing for him. 3 rows of decorations on his left breast, the seal trident on his right. He walked into the room with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has arrived exactly when he intended to. He scanned the room with the speed and completeness of a commander assessing a tactical environment. His gaze moved across the crate, across Dagger, across Lily. It reached Nora. It stopped. Something happened in Whitfield's face. Not surprise, exactly. The expression of a man who has been told something would be the case and has now confirmed that the information was accurate. He moved through the room without redirecting his attention, his path carrying him past Larson, past Brannick, past Polk's frozen tableau, to a position directly in front of Nora Ashford. He stopped 4 feet from her. His right hand rose to the brim of his cover in a salute that was as precise and formal as anything that had ever been executed in this room or any room, a salute that contained within its geometry an entire statement about the nature of rank and service and what both of them actually meant. "Ghost Handler 7, he said, his voice carried to every corner of the hall because he chose for it to carry. "I did not expect to find you here." Nora held his gaze. Her spine, which had been straight all afternoon, did not change. Her chin lifted a degree, her right hand came up, sleeve torn and tattoo visible, and returned his salute with the muscle memory of someone who had performed this exchange under conditions that would make this room seem undemanding. "Admiral," she said. The room didn't exhale. It couldn't. It was too busy trying to reconstruct, all at once, the architecture of an afternoon it had fundamentally misunderstood. The silence lasted longer than anyone would later remember accurately. Memory compresses certain moments. The moments that matter most tend to become, in recollection, either instantaneous or eternal, with no useful middle ground. What happened in American Legion? Post. 1:17 after rear. Admiral Raymond Whitfield returned, Nora Ashford's salute fell into the eternal category. It seemed to those present that the room simply stopped, that the ventilation system stopped, that the faint traffic noise from the street beyond the glass doors stopped, that even the quality of the afternoon light coming through the high windows changed, flattened, held itself in suspension, while 43 people processed the fact that the person they had spent the past 4 hours treating as an unwanted inconvenience had just been saluted, formally and without equivocation, by a flag officer. Then Lily sneezed. It was the sneeze of a 7-year-old who had been crying intermittently for several hours in a hall that was slightly too cold, a small, undignified sound that had no respect for the gravity of the moment. And because it was exactly the kind of sound that cannot be incorporated into high drama, it broke the suspension. The room moved again. Conversations began, stopped, began at lower volumes. People who had been standing in the specific rigidity of shock found their knees remembering how to work. Whitfield did not look away from Nora. "Walk with me," he said. Not a command. The request of a senior officer who has decided that certain things need to be said in something closer to privacy, even when privacy in a room of 43 people is, at best, approximate. They moved to the far wall near the windows, and the room adjusted around them the way rooms do around people who have just been recategorized, giving them space that it had not given before, arranging itself to acknowledge a status that it was still, collectively, absorbing. Brannick watched them go. His hand, which had been raised to signal Polk's approach to Dagger, had come down at some point in the past 30 seconds, and now hung at his side with the slightly lost quality of a gesture that had missed its moment. He turned to Diane Foswell. "Get me everything you have on Ghost K-9 unit assignments under JSOC, Delta Clearance or above." He paused. "And get Colonel Harrison on the phone." Diane was already typing. Across the room, the specific geography of the crisis was reshaping itself. Garrett Polk had stepped back from the crate, the leash re-clipped to his belt, and he stood with the expression of a man reviewing the past 4 hours through a framework that had just become substantially less comfortable than the previous one. The 2 security personnel had drifted toward the wall. Brett Larson had not moved from his position, but the forward weight in his stance had shifted backward, and he was looking at the tattoo on Nora's forearm with the focused attention of someone who wants to read a document but isn't sure they're seeing it correctly. Tommy Riggs crossed to Donovan. He did not position himself beside him. He positioned himself in front of him, in the specific geometry of a man who has decided that another man's freedom of movement is now contingent on his own assessment of whether it should be permitted. "Stay here," Tommy said. Donovan looked at him. "Riggs, stay here." The repetition was quieter than the first iteration, and infinitely more final. Something in Tommy's face had changed in the past 3 minutes. The careful blankness he'd been maintaining all afternoon had been replaced by something sharper and less managed. The expression of a man who has been carrying the weight of a partial truth and has just received information that has made the rest of the truth legible and does not like what it says. Donovan looked toward the exit, looked back at Tommy, made the calculation that experienced operators make in environments where the variables have shifted against them, and arrived at the only rational conclusion. He stayed. Near the crate, Sandra Hayfield had not moved. She was standing 3 feet from Lily, who had returned to Dagger's side in the reliable way of children who know which things in a room are safe. And Sandra was looking at the back of her daughter-in-law's head across the room with an expression that was undergoing a visible, private reconstruction. It was not a comfortable thing to watch, because the reconstruction required the simultaneous demolition of a structure she had been building since the phone call that told her Owen was gone. And she had built it to be strong because she had needed it to be strong, because grief without architecture collapses inward in ways that cannot be survived. The architecture had been. Nora was insufficient. Nora was civilian. Nora was the wrong kind of person for her son, and his choice of her was the one thing about Owen she had never fully made peace with. And now that he was gone, she could hold the insufficiency up as explanation. Not for his death. She wasn't cruel enough for that even in her private mind, but for the quality of his domestic life, for whatever peace he had or had not found. She had needed there to be someone to be disappointed in, and Nora had been available. The architecture was gone now, and Sandra Hayfield, 61 years old, a woman who had raised a SEAL son by being harder than most people around her ever needed to be, stood in the wreckage of it and felt something that bore a family resemblance to shame. By the windows, Whitfield kept his voice low. Not so low that it couldn't be heard by someone positioned carefully, but low enough to give the conversation the shape of privacy. "When did you arrive?" he asked. "Yesterday," Nora said. Lily wanted to sleep in her own bed the night before. She said it without explanation, because the explanation was visible to anyone who had eyes. A 7-year-old whose father had just been killed needed the specific comfort of her own particular ceiling at night, and her mother had provided it. And this was not the kind of decision that required justification. Whitfield nodded. "I was informed you'd be here. I wasn't told about the situation in the room." He glanced toward Brannick. "Major Brannick will have a great deal of paperwork to complete in the coming days." "He was following procedure," Nora said. "He didn't have the clearance to know what the procedure was based on." Whitfield looked at her with the particular attention of someone who has just been reminded why they respected a person. "You're more generous than the situation warrants." "I'm tired," Nora said. It was not a complaint. It was a precise and accurate statement of condition. He studied her face. Then he said, more quietly, "I know what Owen's deployment orders said. I also know what they didn't say, and I know whose name should have been next to his in the briefing and wasn't, and why." He paused. "Ghost K9 Unit 7 has never been officially acknowledged. Owen understood that. He agreed to it." "He didn't agree," Nora said. "He accepted it. There's a difference." Her voice remained level, but something in it had an edge that was not anger. Too old for anger, too worn down to that particular shape. But was the close relative of it that comes from years of watching something true be officially denied. He accepted it because he understood why. That doesn't mean he agreed. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't." From across the room, Dr. Paula Streck was doing what she had wanted to do since Nora's intervention at the crate. She was conducting a proper assessment of Dagger's left hip joint with the quiet thoroughness of a veterinarian who had been waiting for permission that had never officially been granted and had now received something close enough. The dog was tolerating her with the resigned patience of an animal accustomed to medical handling. Not comfortable, not resistant, simply present in the way that well-trained working dogs are present during examination, processing the procedure as information rather than intrusion. Lily sat beside him, her small hand resting on his shoulder. She was watching Streck's hands with the serious attention of a child who has decided that this person is doing something important and is therefore worth understanding. "He's been working through this," Streck said, half to herself, her fingers pressing carefully along the joint capsule. "Since August," Nora said from across the room. She hadn't moved toward them, but she was watching Streck's examination with the peripheral attention of someone who didn't need proximity to evaluate what she was seeing. The jump was hard on that side. He compensates with his stride, shortens the extension on the left hindquarter. If you watch him from behind when he moves, it's almost invisible. Streck looked up. It would take someone who knew his baseline movement extremely well to catch that. "Yes," Nora said, "it would." The simplicity of the answer had the effect of a door opening onto a room that the room's occupants were only beginning to understand was there. Streck reached into her kit bag and prepared an anti-inflammatory injection with the practiced economy of someone who has done this 10,000 times. Dagger's ear twitched at the sensation, but he did not vocalize and did not move. Lily watched the injection with the academic interest of a child who has decided that flinching is optional. "Good boy," Lily said gravely, in a tone that was her mother's tone exactly. The same pitch, the same cadence, the same absolute confidence that the animal in front of her understood and agreed. Streck looked at the child, then at Nora across the room, and filed something away behind her professional expression. There it is. The moment this entire room has been building toward. If your jaw just dropped, you are not alone. This is exactly why we tell stories like this one. Share this video right now with someone who needs a reminder that quiet strength is still the most powerful force in any room. Subscribe if you haven't already. We have more stories just like this one coming every single week. Now let's watch what happens next, because the real reckoning is only just beginning. Brannick crossed the room and stopped in front of Nora and Whitfield. He waited for a pause in their conversation. Whitfield gave him one. "Mrs. Ashford." Brannick's voice had shed the bureaucratic efficiency of its earlier iterations, and arrived at something that cost him more. I need to formally withdraw the K9 reassignment order, effective immediately. He paused, and the pause was the part that cost the most. And I owe you an apology. Nora looked at him. She didn't say it wasn't necessary, or that she understood, or any of the other things people say to make the person apologizing feel better about having done the thing that requires the apology. She said, "Thank you, Major." Brannick held her gaze for another second, nodded, and went to find Polk. The conversation between Brannick and Polk was brief and visible from most of the room. Polk listened with the expression of a man receiving a correction that he is not going to dispute, because the tactical situation has shifted in a direction that makes disputing it inadvisable. The leash came off his belt and was placed on the table. He moved away from the crate. He did not look at Nora again. Tommy Riggs, still maintaining his informal perimeter around Donovan, watched the exchange with a flat attention that had nothing to do with the K9 situation and everything to do with the man 3 feet to his right. "She knew about the channel," Tommy said, not looking at Donovan, continuing a conversation that Donovan might have preferred was over. "And she knew about Sector 7, and she knew about the jump in August." He paused. None of that information was in Owen's personal communications. "I know because I helped him maintain communication security for 18 months. Donovan said nothing. "So either Owen told her things that weren't in his communications," Tommy said, "which means he was operating outside protocol and briefing a civilian on classified operational details. Or," he paused again, and this pause was the weight-bearing one, "she already knew because she was already read in." The silence from Donovan was its own kind of information. "She wasn't a civilian when she married him, was she?" Tommy said. It was not a question. Donovan looked at the wall. "This isn't the place." "You said that about Kandahar for 2 years," Tommy said. "Turns out there's no place that's ever the right place for the things you don't want to talk about. The conversation happens anyway. It just happens on someone else's schedule." The double glass doors at the far end of the hall admitted Chaplain Webb, who had stepped outside briefly and was now returning with the expression of a man who had been doing some significant recalibration of his own in the November air. He crossed toward Sandra Hayfield with the tentative approach of someone uncertain whether the environment is still as volatile as it was 15 minutes ago. Sandra had moved. She was no longer standing near the floral arrangements. She was standing 4 feet from Nora, with the specific frozen quality of a woman who has decided to do something and has not yet found the motion to do it. Webb stopped beside her. He said nothing. He was, at his core, a professional reader of rooms, and this room told him clearly that speaking would be the wrong instrument for the moment. Sandra moved, 2 steps. She took the folding chair directly beside Nora and sat down in it. She did not look at Nora. She looked at Lily, who was still sitting next to Dagger with one hand in his fur and the other turning the dog tags over and over with the patient repetition of a child finding rhythm in a ritual she doesn't fully understand but instinctively trusts. Several seconds passed. "She has his hands," Sandra said. Her voice was barely audible. "The way she holds things. She has Owen's hands." Nora looked at her daughter. "I know," she said. Sandra closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet in the way of a person who has been holding something for a long time and has finally, in the exhaustion of a long afternoon, let it go far enough to surface. "I didn't know," she said. "About any of it. Owen never told me." "He couldn't," Nora said. "It wasn't his information to share." "Was it yours?" "No," Nora said. "It was the Navy's." A pause. "It still is." Sandra looked at the tattoo on Nora's forearm, still visible where the sleeve had torn. She looked at it for a long time, the way people look at things they are trying to make sense of by sustained attention. "Ghost K9, she read. Her voice had the quality of a person reading something in a foreign language that they are sounding out phonetically, trying to locate the meaning. "He used to talk about the dogs. When he talked about work at all, the way he talked about the dogs was different from how he talked about everything else." Nora said nothing. She was listening. "He talked about Dagger once," Sandra continued. "Just once. He said—" She stopped. She seemed to be locating the precise words because they mattered and she didn't want to approximate them. "He said there are some partnerships you don't explain. You just trust them and they carry you? That's what he said." She looked at Nora with eyes that had finally discarded their appointed task. I thought he was talking about the dog. He was, Nora said, among other things. Something moved through Sandra Hayfield's face that was too complicated for any single word, but that contained, in some proportionate mixture, grief and shame and the specific relief of a woman who has been wrong in a way that has cost her something real and has finally been given the material to understand why. She reached out. Her hand found Nora's hand on the armrest between their chairs, and she covered it with hers. Nora did not pull back. She did not speak. She turned her palm upward so that Sandra's hand was held rather than covering, and they sat like that, two women in black, connected by a man neither of them would ever stop missing, while the room continued its complicated work around them. Earl Hutchins, from his chair across the hall, watched this with the expression of a man who has sat long enough in enough difficult rooms to know when a difficult thing has finally happened correctly. He reached into his vest pocket and took out the object his fingers had been resting on for the past hour. It was small and irregular, a flattened piece of metal, copper-colored, with the marks of tremendous force pressed into it from what had clearly been a much more eventful original shape. He held it for a moment, then he rose from his chair. He crossed the room and stopped in front of Nora. Sandra moved her hand. Earl held out the piece of metal on his flat palm. Nora looked at it. She looked at him. Mortar fragment, Earl said. Quang Tri Province, February of '68. Went through the wall of a structure I was standing behind and stopped approximately 1 centimeter from my spine. He turned his palm slightly so the light caught it. I've carried it for 57 years. Everybody asks me why. I never had a good answer, except that it felt dishonest to leave it somewhere. He met her eyes. Nobody asks us why we carry the things we carry. They just need to know we were there. He placed it in her hand and closed her fingers around it. You were there, wherever there was. Nora looked down at the piece of metal in her hand. For the first time since she had walked through the door of American Legion, post 117, her face did something that it had not done all afternoon. Not tears. Something before tears. The specific expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for so long that the act of being recognized for it has no precedent and therefore no prepared response. Thank you, she said. The words were simple, and she meant all of them. Earl nodded. He went back to his chair, settled into it with the deliberate care of his knees, and looked at the middle distance with the satisfaction of a man who has done the one thing he came here to do. Whitfield had moved to speak with Brannock, leaving Nora with a moment of unstructured space for the first time since she'd stood up. She used it the way she had been using every unstructured moment in the past 2 days, by locating Lily. Her daughter had migrated from Dagger's side and was now standing in front of the crate with her hands at her sides, looking at it with the solemn, particular attention that children bring to things they are trying to understand by sheer sustained effort of perception. Nora crossed to her. She stopped beside her and did not tell her to come away or redirect her toward the refreshments or offer any of the other adult interventions that are sometimes kindness and sometimes avoidance. She stood with her. After a moment, Lily said, "Is Daddy in there?" "Part of him," Nora said. "The part that was here is in there. The rest of him is somewhere we don't have a word for." Lily considered this with the methodical seriousness of a child building a structure out of new information. "Dagger knows," she said. It was not a question. "That's why he wouldn't let anyone near." "Yes," Nora said, "because he was protecting him." "Because he was honoring him," Nora said. "It's a little different. Protecting means keeping something from harm. Honoring means marking that something mattered." Lily absorbed this. She reached out and placed both hands flat on the crate's surface, not pressing, just resting. The gesture of a small person making contact with something that contains something that cannot be touched directly. Dagger moved to her left side and sat. His shoulder was at exactly the height of her hip, and she leaned into him slightly without thinking about it, the way people lean into things that are solid and warm. "I want to learn Dutch," Lily said. Nora looked at her daughter. "I know. Will you teach me?" "Yes," Nora said. "I'll teach you." They stood together for another minute in front of the crate, the three of them, the woman, the child, and the dog, while the room reorganized itself around the fact of who the woman actually was. Tommy Riggs found her when she stepped away from the crate to get water for Lily. He appeared at her left shoulder in the way of people who have spent years learning to materialize without announcing themselves, and he kept his voice below the ambient noise. "Donovan's still here," he said. "He hasn't tried to leave. I think he knows it wouldn't go well." A pause. "He's talking, not to me. He made some calls. Whatever he's saying, he's not arguing with anyone on the other end." Tommy's jaw worked. "There's something about Kandahar, Nora. Something beyond what Owen told me. Something Donovan knows that—" He stopped. "How much do you know?" Nora looked at the cup of water in her hand. She looked toward the windows where Donovan was standing with his phone pressed to his ear, his back to the room. "I know what Owen told me the night before his last deployment," she said. "And I know what he didn't tell me, because I could hear it in the spaces between what he said." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "He requested the deployment himself," he said. "I saw the paperwork. He put in for Sector 7 specifically. He said he had intelligence on a target that needed direct confirmation." He looked at Donovan's back. That kind of specific request for a specific sector usually comes from a specific piece of information. And that information had to come from someone with access to the targeting database. Nora said nothing. She was looking at Donovan. "Donovan has access to the targeting database," Tommy said. The silence between them was careful and full. "Owen called me the night before," Nora said. She said it quietly, in the way of a person sharing something that has lived only in their own mind for months and is now being handed to someone else for the first time. He said there was something in Sector 7 he needed to see with his own eyes. He said he couldn't explain. He said," she paused, "some things you have to verify yourself because the documentation can be adjusted, but what you actually see cannot." She looked at Tommy. He was careful about how he said it. He was being careful. Tommy's face had gone very still. "Someone sent him into that sector. Someone gave him a reason to request it himself," Nora said. "That's different. That's cleaner." The distinction landed in the air between them, with the weight of something that had been waiting to be said by someone who understood what it meant. "I'm going to need to make a report," Tommy said. "I know," Nora said. "So will I." She crossed back to Lily. Tommy stayed where he was, looking at Donovan's back, and the expression on his face had settled into something that was not anger and not grief and was not going to be satisfied by anything as simple as either. Whitfield had gathered the room's attention, the way senior officers gather attention, without effort, by simply orienting toward the space and allowing the accumulated weight of his presence to do the work. He stood near the front of the hall, and the conversations that had been filling the room, with the particular noise of 43 people trying to process an unexpected amount of information, gradually quieted. "I'd like to say something," he said. He said it at a register that was conversational rather than commanding, which in the acoustics of the hall meant everyone heard it clearly. "This service is for Petty Officer First Class Owen Harker, and I don't want what happened this afternoon to become the memory that displaces the one we came here to create." He looked at the crate, at Dagger beside it, at Lily with her hand on the dog's back. Owen Harker served this country for 11 years in conditions that most of us will never be asked to comprehend. He served with distinction, with courage, and with the kind of commitment that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. He paused. He also served alongside a partner whose contribution to his operational effectiveness was classified at a level that prevented her from being acknowledged publicly. That classification was the Navy's decision, and it was made for reasons that were operationally sound. It was not made because the contribution was minor. He looked at Nora. It was made because the contribution was too significant to risk exposure. The room was perfectly quiet. Ghost K-9 Unit 7 operated under Joint Special Operations Command for 4 years. Their work, her work, contributed directly to the success of operations that protected American lives in 3 theaters. The official record is sealed, and for good reason, and it will remain sealed. What will not remain sealed, his voice shifted, took on a formal weight, is the acknowledgement that Petty Officer Harker's service record will be updated to reflect his partnership with Ghost Handler 7, by name, in a classified addendum that ensures that within the community that needs to know, the truth is known. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a challenge coin. It was larger than standard, the kind of coin that represents a unit rather than an individual, and in the light, it caught something that glinted with the image of a Malinois in seated posture. The same image, or very nearly, that was inked into the skin of Nora's forearm. He crossed to Lily. He crouched, which required some effort of a man of his age and rank, and held the coin out to her at her eye level. Lily looked at it with the serious consideration she gave everything. "This belonged to your father's unit," Whitfield said. "It belongs to your family now. Keep it somewhere you can find it." Lily took it with both hands. She turned it over and looked at the Malinois. She looked up at the Admiral. "Dagger is on here," she said. "That's right," Whitfield said. "Dagger was Daddy's partner," Lily said. "Dagger was your family's partner," Whitfield said. He stood. He looked at Nora. "He still is." Nora held his gaze. "Thank you, Admiral." "No," Whitfield said, with the final tone of a man closing a ledger that has been opened too long. "Thank you." The applause began from Brannock, which surprised everyone who had been watching him, including probably himself. It was not a military ceremony kind of applause, not crisp and coordinated. It was the applause of a man who had spent an afternoon being wrong about something important and was trying to use his hands to say so. It spread through the room, moving from seat to seat, from person to person, gathering the particular quality of applause that is not performance but release, the sound of 43 people letting go of an afternoon's worth of misdirected certainty. Brett Larson clapped. He clapped with his arms crossed, which was structurally improbable, but somehow he managed it, and his face had the quality of a man who has been reminded of something he knew and had temporarily set aside. Sandra Hayfield clapped with her eyes closed. Tommy Riggs did not clap. He stood very still, and his stillness was its own kind of acknowledgement, the kind that comes from a place too complicated for the simple percussion of palms. Kyle Denton, the youngest SEAL in the room, 24, recently certified, 6 weeks from his first K-9 unit assignment, clapped with the focused attention of someone in the presence of something educational. He had been watching Nora since the moment the tattoo was revealed, not with the complicated reactions of the older operators who had known Owen and carried their own freight, but with the clear-eyed attention of someone for whom this afternoon was building a framework that would last. Streck finished with Dagger, scratched him behind his left ear, and straightened. She gathered her kit and crossed to Nora. "His inflammation markers will be reduced within 48 hours, she said. "I'll flag his record for a comprehensive joint assessment next week, and..." She paused. "I'd like to document his baseline movement profile properly for the new record. If you're willing to walk him through his standard evaluation circuit, I'll observe." "Tomorrow," Nora said. "Tomorrow," Streck agreed. She looked at Nora for a moment with the direct assessment of a medical professional who has just recalibrated a significant prior assumption. "He's beautifully conditioned," she said. "Whoever his primary handler was, they knew what they were doing." Nora said nothing. The corner of her mouth moved by approximately 2 millimeters, which was the closest she had come to a smile since walking through the door 4 hours ago. The hall was settling into the quieter cadences of a gathering that has passed its crisis and is now redistributing itself into the smaller conversations and individual grief work that a memorial service is actually for. Brannock was speaking with Whitfield near the front. A. Polk was at the administrative desk with a pen and what appeared to be forms he was completing, with the focused concentration of a man making a record that he was not entirely comfortable with, but understood was necessary. The security personnel had retired to the corridor. Rosa Ashford, Nora's sister, who had been sitting in the third row from the back since noon and had spent the afternoon in the particular agony of a person watching someone they love be treated badly and being unable to intervene on their behalf in any useful way, crossed to Nora and took her elbow. Not a grip, just a touch. "Are you all right?" Rosa asked. "No," Nora said, "but that's not new." Rosa looked at her with the specific expression of a sibling, the one that contains 17 years of knowing a person, including the years before that person became whatever they later became. "You should have let me say something to Brannock this morning when he met you at the door." "You would have made it worse," Nora said. "I know," Rosa said, "but it would have felt better." She looked around the room, at the slow redistribution of people, at Sandra Hayfield, who had crossed to the crate and was standing near it with the tentative posture of a woman asking permission from a space she previously felt she owned. "She wants to apologize," Rosa said. "I know," Nora said. "Let her find her way to it." Rosa looked at her sister. "How do you do that?" she asked. "How do you just—" "Rosa," Nora looked at her. "I'm very tired. I've been very tired for a long time. When you're that tired, you stop spending energy on things that aren't load-bearing." A pause. Her apology is load-bearing. Getting angry about the timing isn't. Rosa absorbed this. Owen used to say you were the most efficient person he'd ever met. He said it like a complaint, Nora said. Half the time he meant it like a compliment, Rosa said. She put her arm around her sister's shoulders, and they stood together for a moment, watching Lily, who had returned to the crate and was having what appeared to be a low, serious conversation with Dagger that the dog was attending to with complete seriousness, and no indication that he found the communication asymmetry unusual. Kyle Denton approached before the service concluded. He did it with the slight awkwardness of a young person approaching someone they've decided is worth the social risk of potential rejection. And he stopped at a respectful distance and waited to be acknowledged before speaking. Nora turned toward him. "Ma'am," he said, "the honorific was not rank-specific. It was the recognition of someone who merits it. I'm being assigned to K-9 unit in 6 weeks, Malinois program." He stopped. He seemed to be editing what he had intended to say, reducing it to the essential version. If there's anything you think someone starting out should know, anything that isn't in the manual. He stopped again. Nora looked at him for a moment with the assessing attention she had given every person who approached her today, although this time the assessment arrived at a different conclusion. "Learn your dog's name before you learn its training commands," she said. "The commands are in the manual. The name is specific. Spend a week just saying the name, say it in different conditions, say it when you're calm and when you're not. The dog needs to know that its name in your mouth means safety. Not just instruction, not just task. Safety." She paused. "Everything else will follow from that." Denton absorbed this with the seriousness of someone writing something down without paper. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He looked at Dagger, who was watching him with the amber-eyed assessment of an animal that has taken a measurement and filed it. "Thank you." He moved away. Nora watched him go. It was Whitfield who found her again before he left, at the edge of the room near the coat rack, while Lily was occupied with the challenge coin and Dagger and Rosa, who had become an improvised anchor for all three. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. His voice had dropped to the register of a conversation that is not for the room. "It's not a command, it's information. Ghost K-9 unit is being considered for reactivation. A limited program, 2 teams, new assets, new theater." Nora looked at him. "As I said," he continued, "not a command, not even a formal inquiry. Just information that I thought you were entitled to have." He looked at Lily across the room, at Dagger, at the challenge coin catching the light in a 7-year-old's small hands. The program would be different. The mission parameters would be different. The personal requirements would be significantly different from what they were 4 years ago. "You mean I have a daughter now?" Nora said. "I mean, the decision would be yours in a way that previous assignments were not." He looked at her directly. "You've never been given a clean choice before. I wanted you to know that one exists." Nora looked at her daughter. Lily had placed the challenge coin flat on the floor and was crouching over it, showing it to Dagger with the earnest pedagogy of a child teaching something she has just learned. Dagger looked at it, then at Lily, then back at it, in the polite and patient way of an animal that has decided that the important thing is not the coin, but the child showing it. "I'll think about it," Nora said. Whitfield nodded. He straightened his cover. He extended his hand, and she shook it, not the ceremonial clasp of rank, but the grip of 2 people who have been, in some complicated and classified and imperfect way, on the same side of something for a long time. "Owen was one of the finest operators I worked with in 3 decades of service," he said. "That is not a line. It is what I observed." "I know," Nora said. He left. The double-glass doors closed behind him, and the room that remained was a different room from the one that had existed before his arrival. Not calmer exactly, but more organized around an accurate understanding of itself. Brannick stood at the front and delivered the formal remarks with the particular care of a man who knows he is compensating and is trying to compensate appropriately. He spoke about Owen Harker, about his service, his citations, his qualities as an operator and as a member of his community. He spoke carefully and without embellishment, in the way of someone who has learned in the past several hours that embellishment has a way of landing in the wrong place. And then he said something that was not on any prepared card or printed program. "I'd also like to formally acknowledge the contribution of handler Nora Ashford, whose partnership with Petty Officer Harker in service to this country was classified at a level that precluded public acknowledgement during her active service. That acknowledgement is long overdue." He looked at her across the room. "Thank you for your service, Handler Ashford. I'm sorry it took this long for this room to say so." The applause was immediate, and it was not polite. It was the sound of 43 people releasing something that had been building pressure all afternoon, and it filled the hall with a warmth that had not been there before. Not the warmth of celebration exactly, but the warmth of a room that has remembered what it is supposed to be for. Nora received it the way she had received most things that afternoon, without performance, without false modesty. She nodded once. She kept her spine straight. She held Lily's hand, and Lily, who did not fully understand what was happening, but understood the sound of a room that had changed its mind about something, looked up at her mother with a face that was not confused but curious. "Are they clapping for you?" Lily asked. "For your father," Nora said. "I'm just the part of him that's still here." The service continued. Remarks were given. Songs were played through the aging speakers. A seal stood and spoke about Owen with the halting specificity of someone constructing a tribute from the actual materials of a real relationship, omitting nothing uncomfortable and adding nothing convenient. Tommy Riggs spoke last, briefly, about the quality of Owen's silence. The particular kind of silence that some people carry, he said, that is not emptiness, but is everything they have decided does not need to be said because saying it would diminish it. He did not look at Donovan once while he spoke. He looked at Nora. As the formal portion concluded and the room began the gentle dissolution of a gathering that has served its purpose, Sandra Hayfield crossed to the crate one final time. She stood in front of it with her hands at her sides, and after a moment she reached out and placed one palm flat against the surface. She stood like that for a long time. Then she turned and she walked to Nora, and she said, "I would like to know you. I would like to know who my son loved. If you would." She stopped. She was not a woman accustomed to incomplete sentences. It cost her to produce them. "I'm staying at the Marriott on 5th. If you and Lily wanted to have breakfast." Nora looked at her, at the effort visible in every line of her face, at the long distance between the woman who had arrived this afternoon and the woman standing in front of her now. "Tomorrow," Nora said. 8 a.m. Sandra nodded. She looked at Lily. "She has his eyes," she said. "I think I was afraid to see that. I'm not anymore." She touched Lily's hair briefly with the uncertain tenderness of a person relearning a gesture. Then she walked to get her coat. Donovan was still in the room when most others had filtered out. Tommy had not moved far from him all evening, and when the crowd thinned enough that his presence beside Donovan became structurally obvious, Donovan stopped pretending he was there by coincidence and turned to face him. "I made some calls," Donovan said. "I know," Tommy said. "I watched. There are people who want to talk to her." He glanced toward Nora. "About Kandahar, about the channel, about what the orders actually said versus what they were represented as saying." He paused. "I didn't create the situation, Riggs. I inherited it." "There's a difference between inheriting something and perpetuating it," Tommy said. Donovan was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said, and the way he said it had none of the operational flatness of the day's earlier communications. It sounded like what it was, the admission of a man who has been carrying something and has finally, in the exhaustion of a long day, run out of the energy required to hold it up. Tommy held his gaze for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. "Go home, Craig," he said. "Whatever comes next, it isn't tonight's work." Donovan went. The hall was nearly empty. Diane Foswell was stacking chairs with the methodical attention of a woman who restores order to spaces that have had difficult afternoons, and the sound of metal folding against metal was the only real noise in the room. Rosa had taken Lily to the car, along with Dagger, who had exited on a heel command from Nora, so smooth and precise that Polk, watching from near the door, had pressed his lips together and said nothing, which was the most useful thing he had done all day. Nora sat in her chair, the last row chair, the one she had occupied since she walked in, and allowed herself, for the first time in 4 hours, to simply sit, not monitoring the room, not tracking the exits, not managing the distance between herself and the various epicenters of hostility that had arranged themselves across the afternoon. Just sitting in a folding chair, in a nearly empty hall, in a black dress with a torn sleeve, holding a flattened piece of copper-colored metal in her hand that a 78-year-old man had carried for 57 years. The lights above had that particular quality of institutional overhead lighting in the late afternoon, exhausted in uniform, softened by proximity to the windows, where the last of the November light was doing something gentle to the air. She sat for perhaps 5 minutes. Then she stood, put on her coat, arranged Earl's fragment in the inside pocket where she could feel it, and walked toward the door. Tommy was waiting in the corridor. "There's something else," he said, the moment she cleared the door. His voice had changed register, no longer the careful calibration of a man managing a room full of other people's dynamics. The directness of someone saying a necessary thing to someone he trusts with it. Donovan wasn't just protecting information about the channel, he was protecting information about who constructed the targeting request. He met her eyes. Owen was sent into Sector 7 because someone built a reason for him to want to go. The intelligence about the target was manufactured. It was specific enough to be credible and clean enough not to be immediately verifiable. He paused. Someone who understood Owen well enough to know what would make him request that sector. Nora stood very still. "Who had access to his psychological profile?" she said. "His specific response triggers, his patterns." "The unit records," Tommy said. "His commanding officer, his handler." The word landed in the air between them. "I'm not saying you," Tommy said immediately. "I'm telling you that someone used the fact of your existence to understand him well enough to—" He stopped. The handler record was classified, but it was accessed. 14 months ago, 3 weeks before the deployment request. The access log shows a query from inside JSOC infrastructure. "From inside," Nora said. "Yes." The corridor was empty. The sound of Diane's chairs had stopped. Somewhere outside, a car started. "Owen didn't die on a mission," Nora said. The words came out with the quality of something that has been forming in the dark for months and has finally found air. Not raw, too old for raw, clear, the clarity of a thing finally accurately named. He died because someone wanted him dead. Tommy said nothing. He didn't confirm it, and he didn't deny it, and the silence was confirmation enough. Nora looked at the corridor wall. She looked at the thin winter light coming through the glass of the exit door at the far end. She thought about the way Owen had sounded on the phone the night before. Not afraid. Owen was not afraid in the way most people are afraid. Thoughtful, deliberate. The voice of a man who had decided to do something and had made peace with the fact that the deciding was his to do alone. He had known something was wrong. He had gone anyway. The question that had been sitting at the center of her for 3 months, not the grief, which was its own country with its own weather, but the question that existed underneath the grief, the factual operational question, crystallized into its final shape, not, why did he die, but, who decided that he should? She took a breath, let it out slowly, the way she had been taught in conditions that required the management of breath for reasons more immediate than calm. She looked at Tommy. "I'm going to need access to the access logs," she said. "I know," Tommy said. "I've already started pulling them." She pushed the exit door open into the November air. The parking lot was quiet and cold. Rosa's car was idling near the far end, exhaust rising in the early dark. In the back seat, she could see the silhouette of a small person, and, beside it, the unmistakable shape of a Belgian Malinois at rest, the large, patient shape of an animal that has found its people and settled in for whatever comes next. She was almost to the car when her phone vibrated in her coat pocket. She pulled it out. The screen showed no number, not unknown number, not blocked, not private, just empty. The identifier field was absent entirely, which was not a civilian phone feature. She had seen this format once before. She knew exactly what it meant. She looked at it for a moment. The November air moved around her, cold and indifferent and clarifying in the way of cold things. She looked at Lily's silhouette through the car window, at Dagger's shape beside her daughter, at Rosa's hand raised in a small wave from the driver's seat. She pressed accept. She raised the phone to her ear. She said nothing. She listened. The voice on the other end spoke for 11 seconds. What it said rearranged the landscape of the next year of her life with the efficiency of a person who has been waiting to make this call and has been very precise in the preparation of what to say. She lowered the phone. She stood in the parking lot of American Legion Post 117 for 3 seconds, looking at the sky above the car where the first stars were arriving at the edges of the light-polluted darkness over Naval Coronado. Then she opened the car door and got in. Lily looked up from the challenge coin. "Mama," There was a man. Nora looked at her. What man? Outside the hall, when Aunt Rosa brought us out. He was watching the building. He had a phone. He wasn't from the service because he didn't know anyone. Lily said this with the matter-of-fact precision of a child reporting an observation, not an alarm. He was watching the door. Nora turned and looked through the rear window at the entrance to the hall. The door was closed. The parking lot was ordinary. There was no man. What did he look like? She asked. Old, Lily said, with the confident imprecision of a 7-year-old. Like maybe 40. He had a gray jacket. She looked at her mother with the steady, clear eyes that Owen's mother had correctly identified as belonging to the Harker side of the family. Was he supposed to be there? Nora looked at her daughter for a moment, at the dog tag still around her neck, warm from a whole afternoon against her skin, at Dagger, whose amber eyes were on Nora's face with the complete, specific attention of an animal waiting to understand what is required of it. She reached back and put her hand on Lily's knee. You did good, she said. Telling me that was exactly right. Rosa started the car moving. The lights of the lot swept past. In her pocket, next to Earl Hutchins' fragment of a 57-year-old war, her phone was silent. Owen didn't die on a mission. He died because someone wanted him dead. And whoever had placed that call 11 seconds ago, whoever had been watching the building with a gray jacket and a phone, and the patience of someone who had been waiting for a specific set of circumstances to align, knew that she knew. Dagger turned his head and looked out the back window of the car. His amber eyes, steady and specific and old, with a knowledge that had nothing to do with years, tracked something in the darkness behind them that no one else in the car could see. His tail did not move.